Starting the connection. Share on your timeline. Share. Preparing the live stream. Okay. Looks like it's almost. Okay. Okay, live producer. This is a new. Okay. Hang in there a second. Okay. Looks like it's almost there.
I think I see it.
All right. Yep. Okay. All right.
All right. Should I go?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, hello. Sorry if we were all silent there. That's always the awkward beginning of any Zoom meeting, right? So welcome everybody. My name is Mark Rospenda. I'm curator at the South Bend Museum of Art. And welcome to everybody joining us on Facebook. This is the final event related to our 2020 American Series exhibition, Blurring Boundaries, The Women of American Abstract Artists, 1936 to Present. And it's such a wonderful exhibition. I do hope that if you haven't had a chance to see it, come see it. And come see it quick, just in case there's another lockdown and you will miss your chance. So please come visit. We are joined today with the curator of this wonderful exhibition, Rebecca DiGiovanna. I'm sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah.
And I will just give her a brief introduction with her bio. Rebecca DiGiovanna is an independent curator, historian, and artist born in the cultural crossroads of Memphis, Tennessee. Her art historical investigations center on the politics of identity and themes of migrancy and diaspora, constructions of gender and otherness, and modes of collecting and preservation. From 2012 to 2015, Rebecca worked in the Ewing and downtown galleries in Knoxville, Tennessee, where she worked in exhibitions featuring both regional and international artists. Exhibition highlights include Dutch colorist Frans Cuyars, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Close. Color at the Center, architect Richard Meyer, collage works, and printmaker Ruth Weisberg, Time and Again. She's published essays which include Blurring Boundaries, The Women of American Abstract Artists, 1936 to Present in 2018, Larry Brown, Science and Nature, 2016, Neither Here Nor There, Borrowed Bodies, Third Space in the Museum in 2015, and Pinckney Herbert, Distilled, The Narrative Transformed in 2015. Rebecca currently lives in New York City and works at the Drawing Center. She's pursuing an MA in art history at Hunter College. And before I turn things over to her, Rebecca will speak about the exhibition and the history of the American abstract artists. If you have any questions for Rebecca, please post them in the comments in Facebook. We'll be monitoring those, and we can relay those to Rebecca at the end of her talk, and she'll be able to answer a few questions for us. So I will now turn things over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Mark for that wonderful introduction, and Kathy Dietz for coordinating and moderating this event. And a big thank you to South Bend Museum of Art for virtually hosting us tonight. I wanted to thank also International Arts and Artists for sponsoring this tour and bringing it to you in Indiana. And of course, I want to thank American Abstract Artists and the remarkable members, artists, and lenders of this exhibition, without whom it would not be possible. I know that some of the artists are watching with us tonight, and I hope to do their extraordinary work justice, but perhaps they will also chime in on the Facebook chat if they are so inclined. I'm thrilled that you all are joining us tonight. I'm sure this weekday has already been filled with several Zoom calls and some computer screen time, so thanks for being here. I wish that we could all be together in the galleries looking at this work in person, but I'm going to do my best to bring it to you virtually. So without further ado, I thought we would begin by setting the scene and the social context for the eventual founding of American Abstract Artists in 1936. So 1930s America was, as you know, quite the tumultuous time. The economic crash in 1929, which led to the Great Depression, was dragging onward. And of course, there was the rising threat of fascism and the start of World War II in 1939. So artists working in America during this time were collectively exploring the psyche of an uncertain and anxious nation. And they were working to create a new national aesthetic identity that reflected this shifting American landscape. Art critics of this time believed that art should reaffirm the American way of life. And so American social realism and regionalism proliferated as government-sponsored styles of genre painting, specifically because they were homegrown depictions of everyday life that were easily understandable for an American public, and also because they glorified American life for use in political campaigns. Regionalism was exemplified by the overtly masculine and romanticized works of Thomas Hart Benton, John Stuart Curry, and Grant Wood. Afraid that there was something sissified about art and therefore artists, Thomas Hart Benton prized virility, power, and huge scale in his work. And you can see that here in America Today, which is this room-sized panoramic series that consists of 10 wall-sized panels that's installed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. Benton didn't believe that women should be artists, and he was known to ignore women who had the audacity to attend his classes. For him, artists were to be male, their subjects were to be masculine in their energy, and their main connection to females was to be as womanizers. Women in his world were acceptable only as sex objects. Of course, also at this time, Europe and Paris were still considered the center of the art world. And there was this presiding idea that Americans would always be playing catch up to their avant-garde European colleagues. The major New York galleries were filled with exhibitions of School of Paris painters, among them Matisse, Picasso, Rouault, and Soutine. Europe was the purveyor of great, always male artists, and America would always be, in some sense, their fledgling primitive underling. Some suspected abstraction of being un-American because It was thought to be derivative of European avant-garde art, like Impressionism, like Cubism. Even the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which in 1936 presented this exhibition titled Cubism and Abstract Art, displayed almost 400 works of art across its 4 floors, but was criticized by American abstract artists who claimed that Alfred Barr, MoMA's first director and the curator of this exhibition, was playing it very European. The now famous diagram, which Barr created to accompany this exhibition, reinforced this sense that American abstraction was derivative of European styles. Here, Barr proposed 2 categorizations of abstraction, both of which are rooted in European art. The first was geometric abstract art, which was derived from Cézanne, Seurat, Cubism, and Constructivism. And it's represented by principally rectilinear, architectonic, rational forms. The second, non-geometric abstract art, founded in Gauguin, Matisse-like Fauvism, abstract expressionism, and surrealism. This is represented by organic, biomorphic form, and it's characterized as decorative, intuitive, emotional, and romantic. I am sure that I don't need to point out the innate sort of gendering of those terms within those 2 categorizations. The Museum of Modern Art particularly angered young American abstract artists with their contradictory policy of promoting European abstract movements while at the same time endorsing American social realism and regionalism. The Whitney Museum, which had opened in 1931, similarly included few abstract artists and focused on American realism. So American abstractionists were frustrated not having access to exhibition space in New York galleries and museums. And this eventually prompted 4 artists, Rosalind Bengelsdorf, Byron Brown, Albert Swindon, and Ibram Lazal, to meet in Bengelsdorf's studio in 1935 to talk strategy about how to get their work in front of the American public. Following Barr's 1936 exhibition, this group of 4 grew to include more artists, eventually coalescing into American Abstract Artists, the organization, which had 39 founding members, 9 of whom were women, and whose mission was to provide a space for group exhibitions and act as a forum for the sharing of ideas and the promotion of abstraction. Many artists during this time were also receiving support from the Federal Arts Project, which was the visual arts arm of Roosevelt's Great Depression era Works Progress Administration, or WPA. Beginning in 1935, the WPA was a relief measure, which employed out-of-work artists and provided murals and art for municipal buildings and public spaces. Artists like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning were all employed by the WPA before they became famous as pioneers for abstract art. What is significant about the WPA is that it had a non-discrimination clause, meaning that artists need only demonstrate financial need and have a portfolio showing their skills in order to take part in this initiative, which paid about $24 per week, about $400 in today's world. The WPA significantly employed not just white male artists, but female artists and artists of color, those who otherwise would have received little attention in the mainstream art worlds during this time. AA members like Lee Krasner, Louise Nevelson, Pearl Fine, Irene Rice-Piera were all employed with the WPA, which became a social space where artistic friendships were formed and professional networking could be done. Although the WPA did not discriminate against gender or race, the artists were, of course, still employed with specific goals in mind, which was to help the government communicate with the rest of the country, to inspire pride in this seriously troubled nation, and to document the country's war efforts. So naturally, styles like social realism and regionalism were favored over abstraction for their celebration of American industry, labor, and the depiction of ordinary Americans going about their daily lives. The New York region of the WPA was somewhat unique in its support of abstract artwork, primarily because Burgoyne Diller, one of the founding members of American Abstract Artists, headed its mural division from 1935 to 1942. And Burgoyne was instrumental in persuading government bureaucrats to accept abstract art commissions. He did so primarily by describing their work as decorative instead of as art. He said that, quote, "If you introduce the word art when attempting to convince government officials to accept abstract commissions, then you are in for it, and your commission was likely to not be accepted." So these are two examples of murals that he sponsored, both done by founders of American Abstract Artists. Rosalind Bengelsdorf was one of the youngest founding members of American Abstract Artists. She was a rising painter who emerged from under the wing of a generation of male artist mentors, including American regionalist John Stuart Curry, whom she studied with at the Art Students League. When she entered the New York art scene in 1936 as a WPA painter, she was employed to create a series of murals for the Central Nurses Home, shown here on the right. And just like fragmented Cubist collages, her mural is dissected into sections where musical instruments are reproduced or reduced into geometric form, and they're reconstructed to suggest forms which are receding into a three-dimensional space. Her mural had to undergo an approval process by the Art Commission, and interestingly, Bengelsdorf faced difficulties with her proposal for the fifth floor living room. She submitted two proposals prior to this one, both of which were rejected. The first was rejected outright in March, seen here. A second redraft, which included more curvilinear forms, was submitted in June, also rejected, resulting in her third and final proposal, which incorporated, of course, the visual references to musical instruments and was finally approved in December of that year. The color sketch here on the right is included in our exhibition. Interestingly, an abstract mural for the fourth floor living room by Richard Goldman went through the review process without a hitch. It's perhaps uncoincidental and unsurprising that Rosalind's submission, the only one requested to be altered, was also the only one submitted by a female artist. Because of the many biases they faced, it was very common for abstract artists, and women in particular, to work in the same organizations like the WPA and attend the same schools in order to meet and discuss problems of abstraction. Many of the AAA women who worked on the federal murals also attended the atelier of Hans Hofmann, who was a celebrated German emigre artist who transmitted principles of modernism from Munich and Paris to New York. AAA members Lee Krasner, Lillian Keisler, Ray Kaiser Eames, Nell Blaine, Pearl Fine, and Mercedes Karlsmatter all attended Hans Hofmann's classes. Mercedes is pictured here with Hofmann alongside a drawing of Lee Krasner that she sketched during one of his classes. This is also where Lee Krasner and Pearl Fine met and became friends. And while Hofmann's class provided a space of camaraderie for these women, It also became a distinctly gendered and hostile environment in the early days of World War II, particularly when the ratio of men to women in Hoffman's class became uneven as more and more men were drafted into military service. Pearl Fine, who is pictured here with the blank sketchbook in the middle background, recalls one anecdote from these days when she details how Hoffman, who was bitter at losing his prized male students, stood up and pointed at each woman in the classroom, exclaiming, "You'll amount to nothing, you'll amount to nothing, you'll never get anywhere, you'll never get anywhere." American Abstract Artists as an organization was particularly significant because of its receptivity toward women in its membership, at a time when it was highly unusual and uncouth to do so. Just look at other progressive abstract groups around this time, like the Irascibles in 1950. Here you can see a group portrait of 15 of the 18 members, which was photographed by Nina Lean for Life magazine. This group was an informal coalition of abstract artists who protested against the Metropolitan Museum of Art because of its restrictive practices for collecting and exhibiting their work. As you can see, it's decidedly dominated by men, with the exception of Hedda Stern, there tucked in the back. It included artists like Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still and Robert Motherwell, Barnett Newman, and Mark Rothko. Two members of AAA were also participants, Ad Reinhardt there in the back and James Brooks. A revealing anecdote about this group that was conveyed by Lee Krasner herself is that when Barnett Newman, here in the center, telephoned to invite Jackson Pollock, Lee's husband, to pose in this now famous shot, Lee is the one who answered the call, only for Newman to ignore her and to ask to speak to her husband. Lee had joined American Abstract Artists in the late 1930s, and she was a noted and successful abstract artist by this time. She would have even had her first solo show at Betty Parsons Gallery the same year that this photograph was taken. So you can kind of get a sense of how her own contribution to abstraction was often eclipsed by her relationship with Pollock. And it's a common theme that you'll see with many artistic couples from this time, from Elaine and Willem de Kooning to Ray Kaiser and Charles Eames. Artists like Jackson Pollock and his mentor, Thomas Hart Benton, and Lee Krasner's mentor, Hans Hofmann, didn't help the impression of women as artists. Pollock and Hofmann were the norm, as made clear by several articles printed in Art Digest at this time with titles such as Women and Men and The Women Question, in which art by women was judged to be, quote, decorative, inconsequential, entertaining, and forgettable. In July of 1928, Art Digest reprinted this interview with the artist Wayman Adams, who was a faculty member at the Grand Central School of Art, where he said, "There has been a small handful of women painters in the world's history, but in all the history of painting, whenever you find a really distinctive work done by a woman, it is so rare that it merely proves the case that all really great paintings in the world have been done by men." Lee Krasner herself recalls a day in Hans Hofmann's class where Hofmann echoed this idea, giving her the famously backhanded compliment that her work was so good you would not believe it was done by a woman. What was significant about American abstract artists, however, and what Burgoyne Diller demonstrated when he refers to abstraction as decoration in order to convince government bureaucrats to sponsor abstract murals, is that the critique of abstraction as decoration was not limited to just female artists. It was broadly leveled at both male and female abstractionists. And I like to use the term internal exiles to describe the status that both male and female members of American abstract artists shared at this time. They were uniformly criticized, though of course criticism against women contained more gendered and pointed insults. AAA exhibitions were routinely reviewed in New York newspapers and art magazines, and for the first 5 years of AAA's existence, they were consistently negative. Edward Alden Jewell, who was a senior art critic for the New York Times, was highly critical of abstraction. He preferred figurative art. And despite his dislike, he dutifully attended the AAA exhibitions, writing dismissively about their first exhibition here at Squibb Galleries in 1937 with this quote: "Into the wide open spaces in the 33rd floor of the Squibb building, 39 American abstract artists have ventured, each arguing in some degree his endorsement as a raconteur of tales from over yonder, on the river Gauche, that have begun to assume by this time a sly patina of age. What they have put on display at the Squibb makes a colorful, often resounding mass demonstration of decorative design." His reference to the river Gauche is a reference to the left bank of the Seine in Paris, again hinting at that American disdain for abstract art as derivative of the Parisian school painters. Of course, criticism leveled at women artists was explicitly gendered and dismissive. For example, in 1943, in an all-women's exhibition entitled 31 Women at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of this Century Gallery, New York Times reviewer Edward Alden Jewell declared that the work might just as well have been produced by the men, while an anonymous reviewer in Art News asserted that the works promote a new conception of the weaker sex. Other all-female organizations should have a look and a show which is so refreshingly unladylike. Time magazine critic James Stern refused to write about the show altogether. He proclaimed that women should stick to creating with their bodies. Peggy Guggenheim, who was herself indifferent to women artists and was actually only convinced to mount this exhibition by her artist friend Marcel Duchamp, scheduled this show's opening a month before the gallery closed for the summer. This was a date that she considered inconsequential because New York collectors and well-to-do would be by this time flocking out of the city to their summer retreats. An amusing aside of the 31 Women's show that I love and is simply too good not to mention is that Peggy Guggenheim dispatched her then husband, Max Ernst, to go and select paintings for this exhibition. 31 Women was actually slotted just for 30 artists originally. But as the story goes, Max Ernst made a last-minute visit to the artist Dorothea Tanning's studio and was so impressed with her self-portrait that he persuaded Peggy to include Tanning and change the title to 31 Women. Unfortunately for Peggy, this also marked the beginning of Ernst's affair with Dorothea Tanning and the collapse of Guggenheim's marriage. This event prompted Peggy's often quoted remark, "I realized that I should have had only 30 women in the show." You can decide for yourself if this is a perverse sort of cosmic karma for Peggy's disinterest and her treatment of women artists. Peggy actually hosted a second exhibition of women artists again in 1945. This one was titled simply The Women, which included works by AAA members Louise Bourgeois, Lee Krasner, Charmaine Von Vegan, and Nell Blaine. Many of the female artists included were part of artistic couples, like Louise Bourgeois, married to Robert Goldwater, Lee Krasner, of course, partner to Jackson Pollock, and Susie Frelinghuysen, who was married to George L.K. Morris. Women who were married to successful artists, critics, collectors at this time had a modicum of more visibility, but they risked erasure in their husband's shadow, as I noted is often the case with Lee Krasner, who many believe championed Pollock's career to the detriment of her own. Lee's response to that was, quote, "I'm always going to be Mrs. Jackson Pollock. That's a matter of fact, but I painted before Pollock, during Pollock, and after Pollock." Many women of the 1930s were attracted to pure abstraction because it was a style in which the gender of the painter made little difference. Subject matter was problematic for women painters. If they painted flowers as Georgia O'Keeffe or women and children as Mary Cassatt, then they were categorized as presenters of female things, of nature. Pure abstraction, however, gave women a freedom that they did not have when painting realistically, because it did not have what AAA member Pearl Fine called oppressive particularities. To avoid dismissal simply based on their gender, many female artists also used surnames or initialed their canvases. Lenore Krasner, who was famously resistant to the designation of woman artist, signed her works with the androgynous Lee. Irene Rice Pereira simply used the initial I, and Gertrude Green went by Peter. I think contemporary member Alice Adams summed it up well in her essay for Blurring Boundaries with this query: is there a difference between art by women and art by men? For myself, I am unable to discern one. When the artist's names are not provided, can differences actually be ascertained? At a time when abstractionists were valued as little more than decorators, and women were the worst of them, the Organization of American Abstract Artists offered a platform which encouraged its members to speak out against criticism and ambivalence of abstraction, and pushing for their inclusion in museum exhibitions and permanent collections. AAA would eventually organize public protests and picket the Museum of Modern Art. Here's a pamphlet designed by member Ad Reinhardt, which was distributed at the protests and asks, "How modern is the Museum of Modern Art?" From the outset, artists who were women were incorporated into AAA's founding, and they remained instrumental to articulating its mission within the arts community. Founding member Gertrude Green coordinated the group's first exhibitions, including the opening group show at Squibb Gallery in 1937. Esfir Slobodkina was also the organization's first secretary. She later served as president, treasurer, and bibliographer. As I said earlier, among the 39 founding members, 9 were women, and of the group's 15 presidents, 6 have been female. This gender mix was highly unusual at the time, and still today, the group's membership is a nearly even divide between men and women, which is still rather remarkable in the broader art world today. More than 80 years after its founding, AAA continues to nurture and support a vibrant group of artists with diverse identities and approaches to abstraction. And in celebration of this tradition, Blurring Boundaries traces the work of the female artists within AAA from the founders to contemporary practicing artists. Included are works by many of the historic members I've mentioned, including Pearl Fine, Esfir Slobodkina, Lee Krasner, Rosalind Bengelsdorf, Irene Rice Pereira, Alice Trumbull Mason, and Gertrude Green. In these historic works, you can certainly see visual threads which have resonance with MoMA director Alfred Barr's famous diagram of geometric versus non-geometric abstraction. something like the biomorphic curvilinear forms of Lee Krasner's free space, for instance, which is in part inspired by cut paper collages of Matisse and Picasso. In the 70s, Krasner began revisiting and harvesting old paintings and drawings to create with collage. And you can see that free space combines this kind of rhythmic sensuality with hard edge cut shapes, which emphasize a collage-like arrangement of forms. Then there's Alice Trumbull Mason's Saffron Pitch, which is characteristic of Mason's style in the 1960s, which was dominated by flat, vertical bands of color. She is one of several American painters, including Burgoyne Diller, who were called Mondrianists. Except unlike Mondrian, Mason's grids were always implied and her colors are rarely pure. What I love most about this exhibition is the threads which run across time and link the work of contemporary and historic members and allow us to have a conversation that celebrates not only the cumulative history of this group's founding through today, but also to visually explore how each work responds to and diverges from one another to create this intergenerational dialogue of American abstraction. These works are personal responses to particular experiences, to places, to people, the seasons, works of literature, nature and cityscapes, and poetry and dance. And in fact, there are very few works which are untitled in this exhibition. The artists are not shy about letting us know what it is they are responding to, as in Iona Kleinhalt's Mare Nostrum, Casal Abate, or Katinka Mann's Red Yellow Polaroid. Mare Nostrum references the Roman name for the Mediterranean Sea, and Casal Abate is a seaside village on the southeastern coast of Italy. Red Yellow Polaroid was created at the Polaroid Studios in the Museum of Fine Arts, Massachusetts, using a 20 by 24 inch Polaroid camera, one of only 5 in the world. Katinka created photo cutouts in her studio prior, and then spent several hours in the photography studio setting up the colors and the lights for this shot. Through 54 works from 51 artists, Blurring Boundaries explores the singular approach that each artist takes using the guiding principles of abstraction: color, space, light, material, and process. Lorenza Sinai's work, for instance, continues in this tradition of geometric hard-edged abstraction like that of Alice Trumbull Mason. Her work, Certe Volte and Ordine Sparso, her interest resides in the rigor of straight line, of shape, and of formal composition. Both Gertrude Green and Laurie Fendrick imbue geometric shapes with these kind of biomorphic qualities. Green's related forms on the left suggest this kind of interaction between two totem-like bodies, while Laurie Fendrick's anthropomorphic figure is rooted in the familiar and kind of whimsical forms of popular comic characters like Charles Schulz's Peanuts series. Lee Trinsier and Joanne Freeman both make use of the shaped canvas in the tradition of Carmen Herrera and Ellsworth Kelly. The irregular trapezoidal shape serves as a foil to Freeman's looping forms painted in Sweet Spot, whereas in Trinsier's, the primacy of the form of the canvas kind of takes precedence over her painted surface. Esfir Slobodkina, who was born in Russia in 1908, was influenced by the constructivists, which dominated the Russian art scene at this time. The Red L abstraction has these intersecting shapes that take on this kind of mechanical structuring of a blueprint. By this time, she was also beginning her collaboration with the great children's book author Margaret Wise Brown, which led to her pioneering of cut paper collages into children's books and an example of which is her bestseller, Caps for Sale, which was published the same year as her work in 1940. Rhea Hurt and Lynn Umlauf similarly use cut paper in their works, but to extraordinarily different ends. Rhea Hurt's Pretty in Peach, she applies a multitude of different surface treatments using watercolor, acrylic, liquid graphite, and dry pigment to produce this wonderfully layered effect, atmospheric effect. Lynn Umlauf's treatment is more sculptural with a heavy watercolor paper that's glued to a muslin or cotton backing, bound by gum arabic, and then adhered to a single nail, which allows it to kind of float and swivel within the frame. Susan Bonfils and Alice Adams kind of also tread the line between sculpture and painting. Bonfils' Opening treats the canvas as sculpture, and that she slices open the surface to create this opening, which disrupts our perception of it as a painting. You can see in this side installation view, get a sense of the depth of this work. Whereas Alice Adams' White Corner Cast, which is made of celastic resin, can be wound up as a sculpture on a pedestal, or as it's hanging in South Bend, partially hung on the wall, as if it were a painting. And this kind of signals questions of hanging practices as the way that they inform our perception of a work of art. There are examples of clean pattern, unmodulated color, and rigorously controlled pigments, like in Patricia Zarate's Sweet Spot or Siri Berg's Bars. Patricia Zarate's piece occupies a corner of the room, which draws attention to this often overlooked in-between space and fills it instead with this bold, bright color. Siri Berg similarly uses color to coax the viewer into lingering through her multi-panel series, which upon first glance might seem deceptively simple, but with a protracted viewing, it rewards the viewer with this tranquil, chromatic landscape, which we can read in the deepening gradation of purple, almost as a sunset fading along into the horizon. Sharon Brandt and Judith Murray both employ a limited color palette. In Murray's Tribe, this limited palette is, as the artist explains, a universal palette. It's something that she's gleaned from her travels and observation of art and craft around the world. And each of Murray's paintings contain this vertical bar here on the right side of the canvas, which serve as a visual foil for the kind of semi-abstracted figurative objects that are floating in this enigmatic landscape. Sharon Brandt similarly employs a limited palette and a singular bar along the edge of her red and pink #2, which she uses to explore the elemental form of line. Karen Schifano's minimal composition with its descriptive title, It's Curtains for You, Kid, infuses this humorous reading into the curvilinear shapes at the top border, which when coupled with her title kind of take the form of this swiftly falling stage curtain. Several artists explore seriality, combining and recombining vertical or horizontal bands of color as they work out formal problems of light and space. This could be seen in Gabrielle Evert's Toward Light, where Evert's subtly shifts from bands of achromatic gray to bright white. Evert's is part of the Hunter Color School, a group of abstract artists who are centered around New York Center College, where I currently go to school, and whose work is based on the phenomenology of color. Much like the post-impressionists before her, Evert's work deals with the ontology of color, the science of optical mixing, where our perception of color shifts depending on how colors are organized and juxtaposed against one another. Emily Berger and Martha Keller both use the repetitive movement of the paint stroke to explore broken symmetry and linearity. Berger's title, Breathe In, transforms these kind of airy, dry brush marks into a mindful exercise where you can kind of feel each band swelling across the canvas in this meditative inhale and exhale. Keller similarly uses this repetitive movement to record what she calls the honest gesture, which might be punctuated by her physical idiosyncrasies, say steady breathing that's incidentally interrupted by a hiccup. Irene Rousseau's Stretching the Space is also rooted in the repetition of geometric pattern, using a series of square modules which create an interlocking sequence, which the artist likens to the mathematical coherence that we can find in nature. Beatrice Reese and Jane Loegman both use the seriality of written language. You can see in this detailed shot of plum Korean, Loegman replicates the word for plum over and over, creating this concrete poem for the color of plum. In Reese's Kufa, these densely gridded glyphs are stitched together to create a quasi-alphabetical design of pattern and text. Oftentimes, the artists of blurring boundaries root their work in observation and memories pulled from man-made and natural spaces, like in Yukiyama's Fragment, where stacks of pure color are in part inspired by visits to Greek temples in Italy and Greece. Over time and through the filter of memory, Yukiyama distills these architectural spaces down into these horizontal compositions that become metaphors for her experience. And similarly, Nancy Manter, her Remember to Turn is this kind of stratigraphic mapping, but one that has more of a natural appearance of geological columns within the Earth's interior. Liz Ansley's textural passages, in Way You Could Tell, are remnants of observational drawings from outdoor spaces. And Ansley premixes her palette, juxtaposing what she calls both ugly and appealing colors as a way to explore the different color relationships that she could evoke. Both Nola Zorin and Phyllis Ideal incorporate spray paint in their imagined environments. Zorin creates a sense of depth with these stenciled shapes and light enhanced by the use of glitter. And she creates a space that feels kind of otherworldly and wonderfully alien. And Phyllis Ideal's paintings incorporate two different environments from her experiences. The first, the wide open spaces of New Mexico, where she was born. And the second is the congestion of New York City, where she lives and works. C. Roser was a co-founder of the Women in the Arts Foundation. This is an organization that has a very similar function to American Abstract Artists in that it was founded in the 1970s as a solution to the failure of galleries to exhibit works by women. Roser has a very colorful and distinctive style that employs the emblematic language of nature. Here in Fanfare, you can kind of see the suggestion of a looming sunrise against a mountainscape. Mara Held inherited the practice of abstraction from her father, Al Held, whose work was decidedly of the geometric vein of abstraction. Mara's work, however, is very organic, lyrical, uses this ribbon-like patterning that's made from intricately cut stencils, and in this case kind of suggests this psychedelic topography. In Laughter and Forgetting, Cecily Kahn, who is the granddaughter of Alice Trumbull Mason, the founding member of American Abstract Artists, she fragments color into this kind of kaleidoscope of frenzied marks using painting, dripping, pouring, and she often employs chance in her process, similarly to the surrealists who used automatism, the technique of spontaneous, unconscious drawing or writing as a way to reveal the subconscious. Clover Vail is also part of a family of painters. Her grandfather, Eugene Lawrence Vail, was a French-American Impressionist painter, and her father, Lawrence Vail, was married to Peggy Guggenheim before her marriage to Max Ernst. In number 14, Vail employs an intensive mark-making process using ballpoint pen on wood panel to create these hard-edged geometric silhouettes that are not unlike Esfir Slobodkina's kind of constructivist blueprints. Throughout the exhibition, you have these geometric arrangements, which are juxtaposed with works that emphasize the materiality of painting, drawing attention to the very nature of painting itself, which is exemplified by the works of Clara Seidel and Joan Matera. And Seidel is neither here nor there. She treats her canvas kind of like a palimpsest, where she scrapes into this dense surface of paint and oil bars to reveal earlier layers, essentially creating what's like a visual record of her mark-making process. Joan Matera's swipe has a similar sort of quality, where she's building up the surface with these dense layers only to kind of skive into it and create these moments of revelation with these beautiful moments of color that peek out behind this vivid blue. Anne Rusinoff's Inside Out is kind of also taking pleasure in the recorded movement of the body, this physicality of the sweeping, arching gesture that it takes behind these large, bright blooms of wet on wet color. Her earlier iterations of the style began as tightly knit lattices of closed circles, but you can see Inside Out her loosening up of this structure into something that's much more dynamic, much more expressive. The artists of Blurring Boundaries also take inspiration from a surprising range of materials and everyday objects. Meryl Wagner, for instance, began creating this intimate series of tape works in the 1970s, in part inspired by the unorthodox materials of Eva Hesse. And Wagner's own use of tape was as a temporary and practical tool in painting. If anyone's a painter, they use this quite often. But here she meticulously applies these strips of masking tape into geometric forms that are in part inspired by her recollections of the American landscape. Gail Gregg, Susan Smith, Melissa Steger all use scavenged materials for their works. Scored was a scavenged piece of cardboard rescued from a city sidewalk, whose corrugated lines and leathery quality reminded Gregg of the skin of an elephant. In Susan Smith's irregular grid, she recovers found French fry containers from the street, and she glues these fast food containers onto paper and supplements the marks created by the cars and pedestrian traffic using watercolor and pencil to kind of create a trompe l'oeil. Melissa Steger was inspired by a 2013 artistic residency where she visited the metal scrapyard where Robert Rauschenberg would salvage scrap materials for his own works. And she began incorporating found materials into her own assemblages. In connection to ways, she forgoes the canvas for subway tile. Lynn Harlow uses hanging strips of vinyl to create this wonderfully intimate and immersive light-filled space in highlighter yellow in Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which thanks to COVID conditions is now made even more intimate by the fact that it can only be experienced singularly. I was telling Mark I loved this edition of the signage, which recommends that only one party enter at a time. Mary Shaliro similarly suspends translucent strips of mylar from clothespins in an exploration of color and light. And these translucent strips allow color and shadow to project back on the wall behind it, which becomes a part of the work, changing according to the conditions of light. Lisa Nanny's Opposing Forest Green and Blaze Orange Waves is also responsive to changing light conditions. It's made of reflective chromate aluminum and metallic paint markers, so it changes according to however bright the space is. both Raquel Rabinovic and Vera Vasic engaged bodies of water as their co-creators. In Rabinovic's River Library, she collects mud from various riverbeds, in this particular one, the Nile River, and binds it to hand-pressed paper. And in her tidal relief series, Vera Vasic employs the ocean tide as a kind of way to create these large-scale movement drawings in plaster, which I've included a short clip of here. And finally, I thought we would end with Jean Wilkinson's beautiful animated abstractions, which began as drawings and paintings, but through a series of digital manipulations in After Effects and with the overlay of music and sound, became these moving drawings which dance and shapeshift. And you won't hear the sound, but at least you can experience the visuals. So as a celebration of this intergenerational group of artists, one that is both comprehensive and long overdue, Blurring Boundaries highlights the extraordinary ways in which these women of American abstract artists have, for more than 80 years, shifted and shaped the frontiers of American abstraction. And it encompasses a plenitude of approaches, materials, processes, within this shared visual conceptual vocabulary. And it underscores the importance of each work and how it contributes to this visual and thematic conversation with all the rest. I think what emerges most prominently from Blurring Boundaries is this ever-evolving language of abstraction. And it's a language I think is impossible to articulate through the boundaries and stereotypes, say, of a gendered lens. Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you, Rebecca. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being my singular
the singular nodding head.
Yeah.
Oh,
A lot of things that I'm still doing all right.
right. Well, wow, I wish that this could have been in person, but obviously with COVID and everything, this is the best solution and safest solution. Looking at the comments on Facebook, I see so many of the artists in the show are here with us. So
Oh, great.
thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor to have you here tonight. It's an even greater honor to have you in the museum at the South Bend Museum of Art. Your work is amazing. And that's one thing that, as great as that presentation was, the digital images don't do the work at all any justice. The digital images look great, but the work in person is so much better. Which again, I'd like to reiterate to people to please come out and see it in person. If any of this looked interesting to you and you haven't seen the show, definitely come see the show. I don't see any questions yet, but I have a question.
Yes.
And maybe that'll give people a chance to type a question in if they do have any. if anybody does have a question, put it into the Facebook comments and I'll checking it. But what I was wondering was how did this exhibition come about? How did you get involved with the AAA and begin to put this together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was actually conceived by an AAA member, Creighton Michael. I don't know if he's watching, but thank you, Creighton. This is his wonderful and inspired idea. And I became involved because I was a recently graduated undergrad who was trying to figure out my next moves. And so I spent a summer in New York, and Creighton very graciously hosted me for a week. And I was interning at the Katona Museum where he lives. And so we were connected because of my work at the Ewing Gallery. And gradually, I think when he conceived of this idea, he was like, oh, I have a graduate student who might be able to put together this wonderful exhibition. But really, primarily, this work all came together because of the generosity of each of the members. They were so responsive, so excited about putting the show together. And I have learned so much in the 3 to 4 years that we've been working on this exhibition now. I mean, it's really been a long, long journey. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, South Bend is very lucky to have it. So thank you to all the artists for being so generous lending your work. Let me just check the Facebook comments. Anybody have any questions? I'm seeing lots of congratulations and lots of thank yous to Rebecca.
Wonderful. I'll have to look at them after. Can I look at them after? I don't know.
Oh, I do see a question.
Okay.
This is from Willow Sylvester. She says, regarding the rough transition of women not being accepted as artists, why were artists at the same time not as progressive and welcoming as they are seen for the most part now?
Say that one more time for me, Mark.
Yeah. Regarding the rough transition of women not being accepted as artists, why were artists at the time not as progressive and welcoming as they are seen for the most part now? So like, why were artists at the time not as welcoming to women artists?
Oh, I think that was symptomatic of kind of the really anxious time that America was going through. I think like this really expansive idea of masculinity was coming into play. I think that men were, being drafted off to service. And so women had kind of this false sense of having achieved equality for a brief time when it felt like this dynamic had shifted. But I think when they returned in the 40s and 50s and came back to reclaim their jobs, reclaim their spaces, again, it was felt that women hadn't achieved equality in that same way. And of course, that led to the 60s and 70s women's liberation movement. But I think that it's something that we're still struggling with to achieve today. And obviously, we're making strides, but to have exhibitions like this are really still important to kind of shine a light on this very male-made narrative that I think is still present. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I have to say that while you were talking about some of those comments in the past and the way that women artists were discriminated against and women in general, I was getting very upset. I wanted to jump in and say, no, it's awful.
Upsetting. And I remember even when I, had realized that Peggy Guggenheim was dismissive. I mean,
right.
It was a trend not only in men, but also women who kind of had this elevated position, but then used it not to help other women, but to keep them at this lower, pedestal. And so it's very, very interesting to rediscover these different narratives.
Right. Let me check for other questions.
We kind of ran over, so.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. Karen Schifano asks, do you still find that abstraction is difficult for museum viewers as the show travels?
I think so. I think, and maybe this is just my personal perception, but abstraction, you kind of have to be like inaugurated into this sphere of understanding sometimes. I think people have a hesitancy with abstraction, that they're not part of the educated masses to be able to understand it. But that's precisely why abstraction is so beautiful, because it's translating these very fundamental components of aesthetics and beauty that I think anyone can understand and perceive. It just takes a more protracted viewing. But I think people are afraid of abstraction a little bit still, in the sense that they feel like they don't have the chops or the understanding or the education to be able to really like get down into the gritty of it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't tell you, it doesn't hold your hand in the same way that representational work does. It doesn't say this is a rabbit or something like that.
No.
You have to.
It's so much more rewarding when you just like really take the time to look at it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it looks like that was our last question. I'm sorry if I'm missing anything, but that does seem to be the last question. And I think that's a testament to how much that you covered, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no. That was it. I was gonna also, I was trying to find where it was, your companion exhibition, Jamia Richmond.
Oh, yes.
Just as a plug for that, which I think is a wonderful companion to Blurring Boundaries. But she is a Maryland-based artist who's working also cross-media. And I think because Blurring Boundaries is a historical exhibition, this one conversely really responds very urgently to the moment that we're in. I think all of her works were, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, created during COVID, these works in the gallery.
Yep, all 2020. And the exhibition is titled 2020.
Yeah, what a year. So yeah, there's really a remarkable breadth of shows to see at South Bend. So
Yes.
no.
Well, thanks for saying that. I always think that, but it's nice to hear someone else say it too.
Did a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you again to all the artists for coming. Sorry I can't see your faces, but I'll go back and read the chat. So
Yes, thank you all, and hope to see you at the museum, and stay safe.
yes, absolutely. Bye, everyone.
Bye.